Okay, I'm going to spend the next few minutes before the panel discussion walking through some of the main findings of the report. I apologize in advance for the fact that this is going to be a data-dense presentation, and I encourage you to flip through and look at any parts of it that might be of interest to you. It's the third volume in our series on the global burden of armed violence, and in each edition we attempt to shed some new light on neglected aspects of armed violence and to provide a progressively more and more comprehensive overview of the scale and distribution of lethal violence. I think the broad aim, which was summarized very well by the two preceding speakers, is to underline the ways in which high levels of insecurity are a major impediment to human, social, and economic development. We also, I think, want to counteract the somewhat rosy picture that you get from people who focus only on, for example, conflict deaths and war-related violence, who are presenting a vision of an ever-growingly peaceful world. And we want to support the drive to evidence-based programming, which I think is probably the key message to take away. I think I should remind you as well that until recently, and in part because of the Geneva Declaration work, until recently, information and statistics on violence and insecurity was difficult to gather, not always publicly available, politically sensitive, and subject to manipulation. Some of those things are still true for different parts of the world. So the launch of this report is just one step, part of our ongoing efforts to encourage and push states for greater transparency in this area. And as you already know, of course, this coincides with the 2015 negotiations on the framework for Sustainable Development Goals after the Millennium Development Goal period. I'm going to present a view of the key findings. I'm going to do it from a global perspective, and then I'm going to go and zoom in on particular issues and regions. But I first want to say one thing about how we go about this work. We adopt what we could call an integrated approach to armed violence. There are some organizations that count only casualties in armed conflicts or in specific settings. There's others that monitor homicides and criminal-related violence. But we integrate violent deaths across all settings to provide a sort of crucial comparative indicator of relative peacefulness or relative insecurity. So we're counting victims in both large and small wars, in collective and political violence below the level of formal armed conflict, in struggles between large-scale trafficking organizations and gangs, as victims of economically motivated violence, interpersonal and gender-based violence, or in encounters with state officials. So we think only with a holistic perspective to start with can you then zoom in on specific types of violence that may be most affecting particular places. We also do this because in the real world, the lines between criminally motivated and politically motivated violence are often blurry or non-existent. So this is a somewhat unique approach to measuring and monitoring of armed violence, and I think it's one of the strong points of our work. Let me start with the headline statistic. Our report estimates that at least 508,000 people died violently each year between 2007 and 2012. That gives you a global average death rate of 7.4 per 100,000, and I want you to keep that number in mind because virtually every other number I provide will refer to deaths per 100,000. The good news is that this represents a decline of about 3% from our previous edition in 2011, although there has been a spike upwards in conflict-related violence, mainly due to the wars in the Middle East. Now, of course, this total, which is the lethal burden of violence, does not come close to capturing the overall burden both of people who are physically injured or psychologically harmed from violence and those who carry the scars of it for years. But it is a decent proxy indicator that allows us to make some comparisons. Now, there's many ways to estimate the economic costs of armed violence, and we've devoted an entire chapter to looking at this. At the very most expansive end, you could include all of the costs that are associated with providing security, military spending, policing, criminal justice, public health expenditures that are associated with violence. And these estimates are very huge and highly uncertain. So one organization, the Institute for Economics and Peace, has done just that. They've added up absolutely everything, and they've come up with an estimate of the cost of preventing violence and providing security at somewhere around $9 trillion a year. The problem is that many of those costs, such as providing policing or having a functioning criminal justice system, these are actually necessary expenditures in a world, in an imperfect world. So I think we need to have a slightly more narrowly focused take on what the real costs of armed violence are, and we chose to focus on the calculable impact of violence on life expectancy and economic productivity, which is to say, measuring the loss associated with lethal violence. These are tangible effects, and by this benchmark, violent deaths in non-conflict settings represented $171 billion in lost productivity. Now, another way to look at this, which perhaps might also help in the process of setting reasonable targets, is to ask yourself, how many lives would be saved if global violence death rates, this 7.4 per 100,000, were reduced to the average level of, let's call it, an ordinary country, which we would calculate as a rate of around 2.3 per 100,000. This is not the rate of the most peaceful countries in the world, the lowest quintile, which are mostly advanced industrial states, and countries in Western Europe would have violent death rates of around 1 per 100,000. But it's the death rate in average in second quintile countries, which are so-called ordinary states with relatively low levels of violence. And by that standard, we would be able to save, or would have been able to save, 3 million lives between 2000 and 2010. In some particular countries in Central and Latin America, life expectancies would have been 1 full year greater if violence levels were reduced to these ordinary country levels. So these are real human costs. Now, what does the picture look like when we chart the overall distribution of global violence? From a global perspective, violence is highly concentrated in particular states and specific regions, and that's clear from this map here, which is going to highlight the most violent places. 18 countries have rates greater than 30 per 100,000, and that's more than 4 times the global average over this period of 2007 to 2012. These 18 countries are home to only about 280 million people, or somewhat less than 4% of the world's population. So violence is highly concentrated in specific parts of the world. 1/4 of the deaths in places where only 5% of the world's population lives. Now, there's a further 19 countries that have death rates greater than 10 per 100,000, and those are the other 2 blue shades. So if you take the 3 darkest blue shades, you end up with 37 countries that are concentrated in parts of Latin America, Africa, and South Asia. Among this group, only about 1/3 of them were experiencing armed conflict. Now, we can see some positive changes since the previous edition. At the regional level, rates have been declining everywhere, with the exception of Central America and Southern Africa. And overall, almost 3/4 of 189 countries are in the low or very low categories of armed violence. If we look at the 12 countries that are most affected by armed violence, what do we see? Well, not surprisingly, countries at war were and are among the most severely affected, and this is the case for Syria, which had more than 180 deaths per 100,000, and Afghanistan, which is greater than 40 per 100,000. This data only goes up to 2012, and of course we know that there's been a significant upsurge in violence in the Middle East around Syria and the central Middle Eastern area since then. So the picture may even be slightly more bleak for Syria and Iraq. But almost all of the other countries here are not at war, and many of them are in Central America and Latin America. Honduras and Venezuela, just to pick 2 of the top examples, have violent death rates that are 10 times the global average and are comparable to those in war zones. Now, this shows up also in the overall data on armed violence. Only about 70,000 of the global total of more than 500,000 violent deaths occurred in zones of armed conflict, and the remaining 438 in so-called non-conflict settings. Now, the label that's often used to describe these 430,000 deaths is homicide, which is a legal category. But I think that in addition to it being only a legal category that leaves a lot of important things out, it conjures up an image of sort of interpersonal violent exchanges between individuals over specific criminal or economically motivated things. And it doesn't capture very well the large-scale non-conflict violence that you see in places such as northern Nigeria or parts of Mexico. So we really need another way to understand this, and this is one of the reasons we adopt the language of armed violence as opposed to simply talking about conflict or homicidal violence. So this total includes large and small-scale organized and interpersonal violence, as well as deaths in legal interventions at the hands of state agents, which is about 4% of the total. People who, of course, are killed in the course of interactions with police officers or other state officials, and they will not figure in homicide statistics because these are often not legally challengeable deaths. Now, compared to our previous report, these numbers represent an upsurge in conflict-related violence in regions of the world that we all are familiar with from the headlines. So what are the key messages from this overview? Well, the first is that most contemporary violence is not taking place in conflict zones. Most of the states worst affected by armed violence are not at war. Levels of armed violence in non-conflict settings are higher than in most war zones. And much of the violence, but we really don't know how much, is organized, non-random, and in some sense connected with broader conflict and criminal or economically motivated dynamics. It's not interpersonal in the narrow sense, but it's part of a larger dynamic of conflict and crime. Now, one of the important characteristics that this national level data and this global picture obscures is the tremendous variation within states and the concentration of violence in particular zones and regions. And this holds true both in conflict and non-conflict settings. And the following couple slides will illustrate this quite well. In Syria, for example, the majority of the deaths between 2011 and 2014, which we do have slightly better data for that, have been concentrated in and around the Damascus governorate and also in the northern border areas, with high levels of violence also recorded in the areas nearer to Iraq. The picture would have actually become slightly bleaker in recent months and years. I should say that these are absolute numbers in the case of Syria and not rates. And one of the reasons is that very high levels of population displacement have made it extremely difficult to calculate rates because you have a large number of people who have left and don't have good local statistics anymore. What is clear is the extraordinary insecurity in many of the dense urban areas. And this information, which can be taken down to even a more fine-grained georeference level, has been proven extremely useful for humanitarian actors and others who are targeting assistance to high-risk and vulnerable communities. When we contrast this with Central America, and here the map shows Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador put together. The borders are marked but are very unclear here. We see a similar kind of pattern, concentration of violence, and the rates are given here now in per 100,000, along coastal areas and in border zones, regions that are particularly prone to the activities of large-scale gangs and transnational organizations that are engaged in trafficking and smuggling or intense struggles over turf. And they operate also where state institutions are particularly weak. The two little towns that you see marked on, that you did see a moment ago, marked on there, were right across the border. El Cerrito and Copan are on opposite sides of the border, and the violence rates on those sides are extremely high, up to 280 per 100,000 in these areas. Now, there's also major differences in the distribution of violence in urban settings, as the next couple of slides show. In the United States, for example, which has a moderate rate of overall lethal violence of around 4 per 100,000, which puts it at the high end for advanced industrial states, but well below the global average. There's a great deal of variation that depends on the size of the cities. Mid-sized cities, with roughly between 500,000 and 1 million inhabitants, have the highest incidence of violence, with rates that are 3 times the national average, and well above the global average. These are, again, rates that go up to 10. And this is unusual for advanced industrial states. Some specific cities, such as Detroit and New Orleans, have violent death rates that are greater than 40 per 100,000, which, again, if you think about that in comparative terms, is well above the global average and starts to approach some of the levels of the most violent places on the planet. And these places, such as Detroit and New Orleans, are suffering, of course, from economic crisis and depopulation and all sorts of other systemic tensions. What we don't know enough about, however, is the overall distribution and relationship between cities and their countrysides so that we can make good generalizations about urban-related violence. And we can't claim that cities are uniquely violent or understand why some of them are much more violent than others. There's a whole host of other factors at work here. And the case of cities in Brazil provides an excellent example of that. This slide shows the change in homicide rates, lethal violence rates, in 9 different state capitals, listed along the bottom, since 2000. What we did is normalize the rate of violence to 100 for every state or every capital in 2004, and then just charted how much it had gone up or gone down. So these are not comparable rates per se, but they tell you about change over time. So we have major cities such as Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro experiencing significant declines of between 70 and 56%, the 2 lines on the bottom part of the chart, while other cities have seen major increases by 50% or more over those years. Now, we do know that in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, there have been some innovative and quite useful programs in violence prevention and reduction that have been tried there and not necessarily elsewhere in Brazil. But we don't have a really good sense of what works and what doesn't work in some of the different areas in Brazil. And this kind of highlights the way in which disaggregated data, both temporally and geographically, is becoming crucial, and it's more and more available, but it's also becoming crucial for developing practical programs and evaluating whether or not they are actually successful. Now, what about the instruments of violence? Here we focus in on firearms specifically, and our count is that 44% worldwide, 44% of violent deaths involve the use of firearms. It's slightly above that level for homicides, and it's a little bit below that level, around 32%, for conflict deaths, although it's quite difficult to get an accurate assessment of the use of firearms in conflict settings. But either way, they are the single most frequently used method to kill, even though it doesn't surpass 50%. All other instruments come in much lower. Here, too, there is also a wide variation between different regions and different settings. And this chart compares the overall homicide rate with the proportion that involves firearms for several high-violence countries. All of these countries have violent death rates greater than 15 per 100,000 and are well above the global average. And these are all in Latin America and the Caribbean, with the exception of South Africa. So at the extreme end, which is both Honduras and then further down the chart, Guatemala, firearms are involved in more than 80% of the lethal violence, the red band, and the remaining thin green line indicates only the proportion of deaths that's not due to firearms. And in other countries with high rates of lethal violence, such as South Africa along the bottom, firearms play a role in only half of the lethal incidents, and knives and other bladed weapons are proportionally more important in that context. Now, we see the same kind of variability in countries that have low levels of lethal violence, not just the ones that are at the top of our scale, but ones that are not on the chart. So in Eastern Europe and East Asia, firearms account for only about 10% of the lethal exchanges. In Southern Europe, on the other hand, which similar rates of violence to Eastern Europe, firearms account for more than 40% of the deaths. So here, even within Europe, you have tremendous variation. And what this suggests is that there are a number of other factors at work, which include, of course, the legislative framework that governs firearms regulation, the overall level of firearms ownership, the ease with which they can be obtained, which isn't the same thing as levels of ownership, because you can sometimes obtain weapons quite easily even if you don't have them, and the nature of the violence that these countries are experiencing. Now, this slide illustrates that overall there's only a very weak relationship between firearms and violence. If there was an absolutely crystal clear link, as a country's rate of homicide went up along the bottom axis, then there should also be an increase along the top in the rate of firearms violence. So we'd have some kind of line that went from the bottom left to the upper right. This is obviously not the case even from eyeballing it, although there is a bit of a trend line. In the upper right quadrant are countries that are mostly in Latin America and the Caribbean. High rates of violence and high rates of firearms use. There's a lot of variation, however, in the lower left, where you have countries that in general have low levels of violence, but the proportion that firearms account for varies from 50% or more down to almost zero. Now, leaving aside the relationship here, it's worth underlining that firearms violence does not only claim victims directly, that is to say, guns don't only kill people, but are also responsible for injuries and long-lasting physical and psychological effects, including long-term disabilities. Firearms violence tends to have much greater costs as a result of that. Now, the global burden of armed violence also devotes a chapter to charting the lethal dimension of violence against women. I think we all know that it's critical to disaggregate not just by geography and by time, but also by gender and other demographic characteristics of the victims. But for many countries, this information is not publicly available. There are some in which it's available but not made public. And so we've built our global estimates here based on data from 104 different countries. And on this basis, we calculate that there's around 60,000 women victims of lethal violence each year between 2007 and 2012. We don't have good enough data to disaggregate the figures in conflict settings, but in places such as Afghanistan, where the UN assistance mission has collected such figures, roughly 10% of the victims of conflict-related violence are women, but we don't know how many women are victims of other forms of violence, which are, of course, rather extreme in some of those settings. So this map mirrors the earlier one, but now is focusing only on female victims. And the distribution of high and low levels looks roughly similar, with a few exceptions. You will note Russia at the top is higher than it would be for overall levels. One thing that you will notice, and is a crucial point for future policymaking, is that we have very little data in Africa and large parts of Asia, which I think highlights the importance of pushing. I think some of it is collected but not made public, and in many places there's just no data available. Now this slide starts to unpack the figures by looking at variation in the proportion of female homicides in overall deaths. So we have the total homicide on the green bar and the proportion that is accounted for by female homicides in the red. Well, again, Central America and the Caribbean stand out, first two bars on the left, for their relatively high levels of female victimization compared to other regions of the world. If we leave those two areas aside, what's interesting is that the variation in female homicide across the world is much smaller than the variation in overall levels of violence. So there's kind of a baseline of violence, lethal violence against women, that is probably also true for violence against women in general, that seems to be incompressible across different regions. It does not vary nearly as much. Aside from these overall levels, what we don't know much about is how the dynamics of violence against men and women might be linked in either conflict or non-conflict or high and low violence settings. But it's important to examine this because, as Maria Stern has pointed out in a study of Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, the specific and almost exclusive focus on sexual and gender-based violence alone is problematic because it hinders our understanding of the relationship between sexual violence and other forms of violence. And we need to see this in a holistic way in order to even tackle one aspect of this problem. This challenge is pretty clearly illustrated, and I've picked the case of Mexico rather than a conflict-related case, when we look at individual cases. So, by the way, I should say there are two different axes. So the male homicide rate, which is the blue line, is the rate on the right-hand side, and the green line is the female homicide rate in Ciudad Juarez, and the scale is on the left-hand side. The overall rate of female homicides in Mexico is along the bottom here. But what does this slide tell us? Well, we see that the spikes in both male and female homicides track each other almost perfectly. The male homicide rate peaked in 2010 at more than 500 per 100,000. Keep in mind, again, the figures for global averages. And the female homicide rate peaked at just under 50 per 100,000, which also is like in many war zones. Now, if violence against women were purely part of the private sphere and subject to separate dynamics and separate processes, we would not expect these two lines to move together. So this suggests, at least, that in very violent settings, violence is part of a much larger dynamic of what occurs in public spaces. But that's about all we know about this. We cannot say much more at this point. Now, in the past few minutes, I painted a fairly depressing and statistically rich picture of violence and insecurity around the world. It's not a uniformly bleak picture, and I'll try and end on a slightly more positive note, because there has been a noticeable decline in overall levels of lethal violence since 2004. And we now are starting to have good enough data over time that is allowing us to track these kinds of changes. This is clearly going to be crucial for moving forward in the post-2015 period. There's also been important and sometimes very dramatic improvements in security and safety in many cities and in many countries, in particular in parts of Latin America and Asia. And in this volume, we did not look, although we did in 2011, at some of the practical and concrete programs and measures that have been put in place to address specific drivers of violence. But I want to just draw attention here to three things, or three areas, for future work here. The first is that all stakeholders need to develop a deeper understanding of the specific characteristics of violence and insecurity. We know a lot more than we did about the global scope than we did a decade ago, But data, even if it's gathered globally, needs to be actionable at the local level. And many national and local governments have recognized the need for very context-specific information on victims, perpetrators, and weapons, which is obviously the who, what, where, when, why, and how of armed violence. This is a basic foundation for effective policy and programming. The second thing we need is systematic information on best practices, on what has and has not worked, and in particular what has not worked, in different places. There are a whole host of innovative and practical programs that have been tried, but we desperately need to draw together information from quite disparate communities, from the public health community, which the WHO is leading in some of its work on the Violence Prevention Alliance, to the criminal justice community, which includes not just focus on violence, but also on effective policing and security sector reform, and the sort of post-conflict peace-building communities, where there are a lot of programs undertaken. In each of these communities, and there are others, there's a wealth of quite disconnected information on policies and programs, and no systematic overview, no global scan of what works. I personally can't think of any other global bad that is operating on such a weak evidence base for policy and programming. The third thing we need is to strengthen the capacity for monitoring and evaluating programs that promise to improve security and enhance safety and build peaceful societies. Too much work, even today, still relies on fairly flimsy ideas about awareness raising or capacity building without really identifying the drivers of violence or working with a fairly robust theory of change and having good benchmarks for measuring progress. I don't underestimate the difficulty in moving towards that kind of programming, but it's a necessary step, especially to achieve the implementation of Goal 16, should it be approved. Let me just conclude with a couple of observations about the international context, and I think I'm going to echo here what our two first speakers said. When the United Nations member states approved in 2000 the Millennium Declaration, it included not only baskets on development and poverty reduction, human rights, and environmental sustainability, it also included a chapter on promoting peace and security. But the benchmarks that were adopted in the Millennium Development Goals did not include any specific goals, targets, and indicators to reduce insecurity and promote peaceful societies. It took 15 years for us to deliver the message, strongly and in many different forums, that violence and insecurity, which are bad things in themselves, also have a negative impact on development in all of its aspects. And the World Bank highlighted this in 2011 when they pointed out in their annual report that no low-income, fragile, or conflict-affected country had at that point achieved a single Millennium Development Goal. So these are not separate processes. They're integrally linked to the achievement of development objectives. I know that violence and insecurity is messy, difficult, and politically sensitive to deal with, but all of our policies, including in particular development policies, are going to have to tackle complex, messy, and difficult topics if they want to achieve their goals. So there's a whole agenda here, which I think, inshallah, post-September, we will be able to look forward to promoting in the context of the 2015 Security and Development Goals. Thank you.